Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku was framed as the world's greatest villain. Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The air in Yokohama tasted of salt and possibility. A gentle breeze, a welcome refugee from the sea, drifted through the canyons of glass and steel, carrying with it the distant cry of gulls and the low hum of a city breathing. For Izuku Midoriya, it was the perfect day. The sun, a brilliant gold coin in a sea of flawless blue, seemed to reflect his own mood, a bright, buoyant optimism that had been hard-won through blood, sweat, and shattered bones. He was perched on the edge of a 60-story skyscraper, the wind teasing the wild green-black tufts of his hair. Below, the sprawling urban landscape was a meticulously designed stage for today's grand performance, a city-wide joint training exercise. It was the largest of its kind ever attempted, a collaboration between UA's finest, the top students from Shiketsu and Ketsubutsu, and a legion of pro-heroes, all working together to simulate and respond to a large-scale villain attack. For once, the chaos was controlled, the screams were pre-recorded, and the collapsing buildings were holographic illusions. It was a playground for heroes, and Deku was in his element. A surge of green lightning, as familiar now as his own heartbeat, crackled around his limbs. He pushed off the ledge, dropping into a controlled freefall. The city rushed up to meet him, a dizzying mosaic of streets and rooftops. He felt a familiar, exhilarating pull in his gut, the raw power of one for all humming beneath his skin, no longer a raging beast threatening to tear him apart, but a loyal partner. Float as a go, he murmured into his calm, his voice calm and steady. The sensation of weightlessness caught him 100 feet above the street, and he shifted his momentum, angling his body horizontally. Black tendrils, slick and powerful, erupted from his back and arms, anchoring to the corners of nearby buildings. Using Black Whip, he propelled himself forward, a silent, emerald comet streaking through the simulated battle zone. This was the new Deku. The one forged in the crucible of the Paranormal Liberation War. The one who had danced with death and returned with 7 quirks at his command. The clumsy, self-destructive boy was a ghost, a memory. In his place stood a young man who moved with a fluid, terrifying grace. He could feel the energy building in his legs with Fa gene, sense incoming threats with a prickling danger sense that was now a low, constant thrum of awareness, and blanket an area in a disorienting haze with smokescreen. He was a one-man army, but more importantly, he was a one-man rescue squad. Midoriya, report, a voice, crisp and authoritative, crackled in his ear. Ida. 5 civilian actors secured from the collapsed subway sim on Block C, Deku replied, landing softly on a rooftop where a group of actors in dust-covered clothes were being tended to by a medical team. No further hostiles detected in this quadrant. Moving to support Todoroki at the waterfront. Excellent work. Your efficiency is, as always, commendable, Deku smiled. Even in the heat of the drill, Ida was Ida. He gave a thumbs up to one of the actors, a young girl who looked at him with wide, adoring eyes, before launching himself back into the sky. He saw Todoroki below, a figure of stark contrast. One half of the plaza was coated in a glacier of ice, trapping a dozen villain bots, while the other half was being blasted with controlled waves of brilliant orange flame to corner the rest. He was a force of nature, efficient and devastatingly powerful. As Deku flew overhead, he caught sight of Uraraka. She was coordinating civilian evacuation, her quirk making the monumental task of lifting debris and moving injured people look effortless. She glanced up, as if sensing his presence, and their eyes met for a fraction of a second across the controlled pandemonium. A warm, brilliant smile lit up her face, a beacon in the manufactured chaos. He felt a familiar flutter in his chest, a lightness that had nothing to do with his quirk. He offered a quick smile back, a silent promise of mochi and conversation once the day was done. The world, for that one brief moment, felt impossibly small and wonderfully perfect. Then a blur of orange and black exploded past him, propelled by concussive blasts that smelled of nitroglycerin. Try not to get in my way, you damn nerd! Bakugo snarled, his voice a familiar, gravelly roar. But the heat was gone. The venom that had defined their childhood had, over the past year, cooled into something else entirely. It was the hardened steel of rivalry, not the brittle glass of animosity. Bakugo wasn't trying to tear him down anymore. He was trying to outclimb him, to reach the summit first. "You too, Kaken!" Deku called back, a genuine grin splitting his face. He watched as Bakugo used a series of precise, targeted explosions to maneuver around a building and ambush a high-level villain actor, his movements more refined and less wantonly destructive than they used to be. He was a howitzer that had learned to be a scalpel. They were all growing. They were all becoming the heroes they were meant to be. The command tent was a hub of cool, collected energy. On the central monitor, dozens of camera feeds showed the exercise winding down. Endeavor, the #1 hero, stood with his arms crossed, his flaming mustache flickering as he observed the students' performance. His gaze, once a source of unbearable pressure for his son, now held a glint of what looked disturbingly like pride as he watched Todoroki encase the final villain bot in a tomb of ice. "Impressive," Hawks remarked, leaning casually against the console, a feather lazily twirling in his hand. "The new generation. They're fast." "They're more than fast," Mirko added, cracking her knuckles. "They're smart. Look at Midoriya. He's not just using his power, he's conducting it. Like a symphony of ass-kicking." Endeavor grunted, a low rumble in his chest. "He is All Might's successor. We would expect nothing less. The potential there is astronomical. He represents the future, a new kind of symbol." It was the highest praise Deku had ever received from the stoic flame hero, and he wasn't even there to hear it. But the sentiment hung in the air, an undisputed fact. Izuku Midoriya was the future. He was the world's brightest hope. The final all-clear signal was given. The exercise was over. A collective sigh of relief and satisfaction went through the ranks. It had been a resounding success, and then the world broke. It started not with a bang, but with a tremor. A low, deep shudder that vibrated up from the concrete, rattling teeth and shaking the holographic projectors until they fizzled out. Car alarms began to shriek, a discordant symphony of panic. Deku landed on a rooftop, his boots skidding on the gravel. "What was that? An earthquake?" he asked into his comms. "Negative." Ida's voice was tight with alarm. "Seismic activity is localized. Origin point, the government district. 2 kilometers east of your position." Before anyone could process the information, a sound wave washed over the city. It was a deafening, gut-wrenching boom, a sound so colossal it felt like the sky itself was being ripped in two. Deku's head snapped up, his eyes wide. Over the gleaming towers of the Minato Mirai district, a plume of black smoke and angry orange fire was climbing into the pristine blue sky. It was centered on the Yokohama Central Government Complex, a symbol of civic order and stability. This was not a drill. His danger sense, which had been a quiet hum all day, screamed. It wasn't a single sharp point of malice but a blinding, overwhelming flood of it, coming from the direction of the explosion. It was raw, unadulterated terror and pain, a psychic shockwave that made him stagger. "All units, this is a real-world incident. I repeat, this is real." Endeavor's voice blasted through the comms, cutting through the confusion. "All pro-heroes converge on the government district. Students, fall back to the designated safe zone and assist with civilian triage. Do not engage." The order was clear, sensible. But Deku couldn't move. He was staring at the heart of the destruction, at the pillar of smoke, and he saw it. A flicker. A flash of brilliant, unmistakable green. It was lightning. His lightning. The unique, vibrant energy signature of One for All. It arced through the smoke, impossibly bright, and slammed into the side of the district's communications tower, a 900-foot spire of steel and broadcast arrays. A cascade of glass and metal rained down onto the streets below. "No," Deku whispered, his blood turning to ice. That's not possible." Then came the second impossibility. From the gaping hole in the tower, tendrils of pure blackness erupted. They writhed and whipped through the air like enraged serpents, lashing out at the surrounding buildings. They were identical, perfectly identical, to his black whip. They tore through concrete and steel with sickening ease, pulling down entire sections of facades, sending tons of debris plummeting towards the terrified crowds that were now fleeing in the streets. He could hear the screaming now, even from 2 kilometers away. It was a sound that would be seared into his memory for the rest of his life. What is going on? Uraraka's voice was a trembling whisper in his ear. Midoriya, that looks like... She couldn't finish the sentence. No one could. They were all seeing it. The pro-heroes streaking towards the disaster, the students frozen in horrified disbelief. On every news feed, from every helicopter camera, the image was the same, the unmistakable, signature abilities of the hero Deku, being used to systematically and brutally dismantle a city. And then, the final, masterfully cruel stroke of the knife. Every screen in the city flickered. The jumbotrons in the shopping districts, the TVs in apartment windows, the cell phones in the hands of fleeing civilians. They all went black for a second, then lit up with a single, horrifying image. It was him. He was standing on a pile of rubble, the burning communications tower silhouetted behind him. His hero costume, the gamma suit his friends had helped him design, was pristine. His expression was one he had never worn in his life, a cold, severe certainty, devoid of empathy or warmth. His green eyes, usually so full of emotion and kindness, were flat and hard as emerald chips. The camera zoomed in on his face, and then he spoke. His voice, perfectly modulated, chillingly familiar, broadcast to the entire world. For years you have placed your faith in a broken system. The figure on the screen said, its voice a perfect, soulless replica of his own. You have worshipped false idols and clung to a fragile peace built on lies. You were told that heroes would always save you, that a smile could conquer all evil. It was a comforting, childish fantasy. In the command tent, a phone clattered to the floor. It was Uraraka's. Her face was ashen, her eyes wide with a denial so fierce it was almost painful to witness. Ida stood ramrod straight, his whole body trembling. Bakugo, for the first time in years, looked completely and utterly lost, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists at his sides, his crimson eyes fixed on the screen in mute, savage disbelief. The Deku on the screen gestured dismissively at the destruction behind him. This is the result of that fantasy. A society grown weak, dependent, and corrupt. A society that must be purged. All Might's way was a failure. His naive idealism bred complacency. He did not save the world. He merely anesthetized it. Somewhere, in a quiet observation room at UA, Toshinori Yagi watched the broadcast on a large monitor. The color drained from his already gaunt face. His skeletal hand, holding a cup of tea, began to shake so violently that the cup slipped, shattering on the floor. The sound was deafening in the silent room. He stared at the face of his successor, the boy he had chosen, the boy he loved like a son, and saw a monster wearing his face. The age of false symbols is over. The deepfake continued, its voice rising with messianic fervor. True salvation does not come from 1,000 different heroes with 1,000 different agendas. It comes from a singular vision. A strong hand to guide, to protect, and to cleanse. I will save you all. Not by coddling you, but by carving out the rot. I will be the villain this world needs, so that from its ashes, a true and lasting order can be born. This is not an act of terror. It is an act of purification. My purification. The screen went black. A profound, suffocating silence fell over the city, broken only by the distant sirens and the crackle of fires. The message had been delivered. The evidence was irrefutable. The hero Deku, the next symbol of peace, had just declared war on the world. The real Izuku Midoriya was still 2 kilometers away, in a part of the city largely untouched by the direct assault. The broadcast had played on a nearby storefront TV before the power cut out. He had seen it. He had heard it. His mind was a maelstrom of white-hot denial and icy dread. It was a trick. A quirk. Someone like Toga, but with voice mimicry. Someone like... All for One. The thought was a shard of ice in his gut, but All for One was imprisoned. Wasn't he? His heroic instincts, the very core of his being, took over. The speech, the frame-up. He could worry about that later. People were hurt. People were trapped. He ignored Endeavor's order. He had to. He launched himself towards the edge of the disaster zone, not the epicenter, but the periphery, where the panic was causing its own kind of chaos. He found a family, a mother, a father, and a small boy, huddled in the doorway of a shoe store, its front window shattered, the awning above them groaning under the weight of fallen debris from a higher floor. "It's going to collapse!" the mother shrieked, shielding her son. Without a second thought, Deku was there. "Get back!" he yelled, his own voice sounding raw and unfamiliar to his ears. He planted his feet, flexed, and caught the massive slab of concrete and steel as it fell. The strain was immense, his muscles screaming in protest. Green lightning flared around him, his real lightning, born of desperation and the will to protect. He gritted his teeth, the weight pressing down on him. "Go! Now!" The family scrambled out from under the collapsing awning and into the street. The father turned back, his face a mask of awe and terror. "Thank you, Deku," he stammered, then his eyes widened in horrified recognition, the name dying on his lips. Deku grunted, heaving the tons of debris to the side, where it crashed into the empty street. He stood, panting, his body aching. He looked at the family he had just saved. The little boy was hiding behind his mother's legs. The mother and father were backing away slowly, their expressions not of gratitude, but of pure, undiluted fear. They were looking at him like he was a monster. It was then that he felt it. Dozens of them. The familiar energy signatures of pro-heroes, converging on his position with terrifying speed. He turned. A shadow fell over him. Endeavor landed first, his boots hitting the asphalt with a heavy, final thud. The heat radiating from him was intense, a suffocating wall of fury. Behind him, more heroes landed, forming a semicircle. Best Jeanist, his denim cables already unspooling. Mirko, her body tensed like a compressed spring. Hawks, his feathers floating in the air, each one pointed at him like a crimson dagger. Even some of his own teachers, Cementos, Ectoplasm, were there, their faces grim and set. They weren't looking at a colleague. They weren't looking at a student. They were looking at a target. Deku's heart hammered against his ribs. Confusion warred with a rising tide of panic. Endeavor-san? What's going on? There was an attack. That video, it wasn't me. It's a trick. A trap. His voice was desperate, pleading. He took a step forward, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Stay where you are." Endeavor's voice was a low growl, rumbling like an earthquake. There was no understanding in his turquoise eyes. There was only a maelstrom of shock, betrayal, and the cold, hard weight of duty. He had seen the power. He had heard the speech. His mind, trained to deal in absolutes and evidence, had already rendered its verdict. "But you have to listen to me," Deku begged, his eyes darting from face to face, searching for a single flicker of trust, a single shred of doubt. He found none. He saw only grim resolve, sorrow, and anger. They were his allies, his mentors, his friends. And they were all looking at him as if he were their greatest enemy. "We saw it, Midoriya," Hawks said softly, his voice laced with a genuine, cutting sadness. "We all saw it." The truth of his situation crashed down on him with the force of a physical blow. They wouldn't listen. The evidence was too perfect, the attack too devastating, the lie too complete. Anything he said would be dismissed as a villain's desperate deception. He was trapped. Endeavor raised his left hand, a sphere of incandescent flame gathering in his palm. It illuminated the dust and smoke swirling in the air, casting long, monstrous shadows. The heat was a promise of swift, overwhelming force. The number one hero looked at the boy who was meant to be the world's greatest hope, his face a mask of stone. "Izuku Midoriya," Endeavor declared, his voice booming through the ruined street, each word a nail in the coffin of Deku's life. "You are under arrest for an unprecedented act of terrorism." The world had narrowed to the space between one frantic heartbeat and the next. Endeavor's declaration, "You are under arrest," was not a sentence. It was a guillotine, dropped and waiting to sever Izuku Midoriya's life from everything he had ever known. The air, thick with dust and the smell of ozone, crackled with a tension so profound it was almost a physical force. "Please!" Deku's voice was a raw, desperate rasp. He kept his hands raised, palms open, a universal sign of surrender he didn't feel. "You have to listen. My quirk, it can be copied. Someone like Monoma, or something new. All for One's network isn't completely gone." This is a frame-up. Endeavor's fiery gaze didn't waver. His face was a granite mask of grim duty. To him, this was just another lie from a villain who had finally shown his true colors. The pleading, the wide-eyed innocence, it was all part of the act. He had seen villains feign remorse 1,000 times. But never on this scale. Never with this level of betrayal. We have visual confirmation from 24 news helicopters and hundreds of civilian feeds. Endeavor's voice was a low growl, each word laced with condemnation. We have your energy signature blanketing the entire district. We have your confession, broadcast to the world. What we have, Midoriya, is irrefutable proof. It's not proof if it's a lie. Deku cried out, his voice cracking. He looked past the wall of flame and fury that was Endeavor, his eyes scanning the faces of the other heroes. He saw Mirko, her body coiled like a panther ready to strike, her usual boisterous grin replaced by a grim, disappointed scowl. He saw Best Jeanist, his expression unreadable behind his high collar, but the subtle tension in his posture spoke volumes. He saw Hawks, and for a fleeting moment, he saw a flicker of something in the wing hero's golden eyes. It wasn't belief, not yet, but a sliver of analytical uncertainty, a professional weighing an impossible scenario. It was the faintest glimmer of hope, and it was extinguished in the next second. Don't make this harder than it needs to be, kid, Mirko said, her voice tight. Surrender now. There's nowhere to run, but surrendering meant accepting their narrative. It meant being put in a box, likely in the depths of Tartarus, while the real villain, the one who had orchestrated this masterpiece of deceit, walked free to continue their plan. He would be a footnote in their victory. The tragic story of the hero who fell. No, he couldn't let that happen. He had to find the truth. And he couldn't do that from a cage. His mind, a hurricane of panic just moments before, began to clear, sharpened by the terrifying clarity of his situation. He wasn't fighting for his innocence anymore. That was already lost. He was fighting for his freedom. The decision was made in the space of a single, stolen breath. He would not fight them. He would not hurt them. But he would not be taken. I'm sorry, he whispered. The words meant more for himself than for them. The first move came from Mirko. Faster than a blink, she launched herself forward, her legs scything through the air in a devastating arc aimed at his head. His danger sense, a screaming siren in his skull, had warned him a microsecond before she moved. He dropped, the kick whistling over his hair, and pushed off the ground, rolling backward. He didn't come up swinging. He came up running. He's running! Contain him! Endeavor roared. Deku pushed a sliver of power from One for All into his legs, just enough for a burst of speed. The pavement cracked under his feet as he shot down the debris-strewn street. He wasn't heading towards the city center, but away from it, towards the labyrinthine industrial parks and docklands that bordered the district. Anonymity was his only shield. A thick, dark cable of denim shot past his head, followed by a dozen more. Best Jeanist was already at work, weaving a net to ensnare him. The fibers wrapped around a lamppost and a wrecked car, creating an impassable barrier. Deku didn't try to break through it. He went over it. Float. He grunted, the sensation of weightlessness catching him. He soared into the air, 10 feet, 20 feet, a sudden, unexpected verticality that made some of the ground-based heroes pause. He didn't get far. A jet of flame, precise as a laser, shot past his shoulder, forcing him to swerve. Endeavor was airborne, propelled by his own inferno, a vengeful god closing the distance with terrible speed. You cannot escape. Deku knew he couldn't outfly the number one hero in open air. He needed cover. He needed complexity. He activated smokescreen. A thick, billowing cloud of black smoke erupted from his body, instantly obscuring him from view. It was a ninja's trick, a tool for evasion, not destruction. Inside the blinding shroud, he cut float and angled his body downward. He burst out of the bottom of the smoke cloud, dropping towards the roof of a 5-story office building. He landed hard, rolling to absorb the impact. His comm unit crackled to life, a cacophony of panicked, angry voices. Ost visual. He's using smokescreen. Signature is on the roof of the Kanto Logistics building. All units converge. They could track his energy. Of course they could. Every time he used OFA, it was like setting off a flare. He had to be smarter. He pushed off the roof, launching himself across an alleyway to the next building. As he flew, he saw hawks descending from above, a storm of crimson feathers detaching from his wings, hardening into razor-sharp blades as they rocketed towards him. There was no time to dodge them all. Acting on pure instinct, he spun in midair, black whip erupting from his back. It wasn't the thick, destructive tendrils the world had just seen on TV. These were thin, agile whips. They formed a defensive cocoon around him for a split second, deflecting the storm of feathers with a series of sharp pings and thwacks. A few still got through, slicing through his suit and leaving shallow, burning cuts along his arms and legs. He landed on the next roof, stumbling from the pain. The act of using Black Whip, of using a quirk so publicly associated with his attack, felt like pouring gasoline on the fire of his own condemnation. He could hear the news helicopters now, their rhythmic whump-whump-whump growing closer, their cameras broadcasting his every move. He glanced up and saw them, vultures circling a kill. He was no longer a person. He was a spectacle. A massive wall of cement suddenly erupted from the street below, rising to block his path. Cementos. He was being systematically cornered. He turned back, and Endeavor was there, hovering 50 feet away, his body wreathed in an aura of blistering heat. "It's over, Midoriya. There is nowhere left for you to go." Deku's eyes darted around, his mind racing, processing angles, trajectories, structural weaknesses. His gaze fell upon a massive, already damaged water tower on the edge of the roof, weakened by the initial shockwave. It was between him and Endeavor. It was a terrible idea. It was his only idea. With a surge of desperation, he fired a single, thick strand of Black Whip. It wrapped around the base of the tower's supporting legs. With a guttural yell, he pulled. The metal groaned, twisted, and then gave way. The massive tank, holding thousands of gallons of water, toppled over, not towards Endeavor, but in a path that would cut off his pursuit. To the heroes on the ground, to the cameras in the sky, the image was damning. Deku, the supposed hero, was casually destroying public property, endangering everyone, just to secure his escape. It was the final nail in his coffin. Endeavor was forced to blast the falling tower with a concentrated burst of flame, flash boiling the water into a massive cloud of steam and vaporizing the metal into slag before it could hit the street below. The momentary diversion was all Deku needed. He sprinted to the edge of the roof, leaped into the abyss of the concrete canyon, and used a combination of FA gene-powered jumps and Black Whip tendrils to swing and ricochet through the maze of buildings, moving with a desperate, frantic energy. He stayed low, in the shadows, out of the open sky. He escaped. But as he fled, the sounds of his former allies faded, replaced by the crushing silence of his new reality. He had won his freedom, but in doing so, he had proven his guilt to the entire world. The official announcement came less than an hour later. The Hero Public Safety Commission, its authority absolute in moments of crisis, held an emergency press conference. The woman at the podium was the commission's president, a severe-looking figure named Shiakawa, her face etched with a mixture of sorrow and iron resolve. "Today, Japan and the world have suffered a wound of unprecedented depth," she began, her voice steady and somber, broadcast on every channel, on every screen. "The hero known as Deku, a student of UA High School and the designated successor to All Might's legacy, has committed an act of supreme betrayal." A wave of murmurs went through the press corps, quickly silenced by a glare from the president. "His coordinated attack on Yokohama's government district, followed by his violent and destructive escape from apprehending heroes, has left us with no alternative. Effective immediately, Izuku Midoriya is designated a villain of the highest possible threat level, SSS rank. A class created for a threat to global stability itself." She paused, letting the weight of the new classification sink in. "By our authority, he has been given a new designation. He is to be known as the villain, Chaos. The name hit the public consciousness like a physical blow. Chaos. It was perfect. It encapsulated the horror of what they had all witnessed. The bright, smiling face of Deku was scrubbed from the narrative, replaced by a moniker fit for a monster. The world's reaction was immediate and brutal. The trust in heroes, already cracked and fragile after the Paranormal Liberation War, did not just break, it atomized. If their brightest hope, their next all-might, could harbor such darkness, then who could be trusted? The backlash was not a slow tide. It was a tsunami of fear and rage. In city squares across the country, piles of Deku merchandise, action figures, all-might-era trading cards, posters, plus Ultra t-shirts, were gathered and set ablaze. The cheerful, determined face of the young hero melted into plastic slag and pyres of public fury. Parents who had once pointed to him as a role model now spoke his name like a curse, trying to explain to their crying children why their favorite hero was now a villain. On television, panels of tearful analysts and furious commentators dissected his every past action. His self-destructive tendencies in his early years were recontextualized as the first signs of a violent, unstable psyche. His fierce determination was repainted as ruthless ambition. His endless muttering was no longer the quirk of an analytical mind, but the ravings of a budding megalomaniac. A narrative was being written in real time, and it was utterly convincing. In a quiet apartment in Muzurifu, a frantic Inko Midoriya was being shielded from the press by police officers, her world collapsing around her. The door to her apartment was already vandalized, the word monster spray-painted in crude, dripping red letters. She couldn't reconcile the boy on the screen with the sweet, crying child who had always wanted to be a hero more than anything in the world. At UA High, the Heights Alliance dormitory was suffocatingly silent. The members of Class 1A were gathered in the common room, their faces illuminated by the cold, blue light of the television screen. They had seen the attack. They had heard the speech. And they had just watched the live footage of Deku's desperate, violent-looking escape. Achiko Uraraka sat curled on a sofa, her knees pulled up to her chest. She was shaking her head, a slow, constant motion of denial. No, it's not him, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her knuckles were white where she was clutching a small, cheap keychain, a little all-might figurine he had won for her at a festival booth months ago. It felt impossibly heavy in her hand. Deku-kun wouldn't, he couldn't. Her heart screamed that it was a lie, but her eyes had seen the same footage as everyone else. The conflict was tearing her apart. Tenya Ida stood rigidly near the back of the room, his arms straight at his sides. His glasses couldn't hide the profound confusion and horror in his eyes. As the class representative, his mind was supposed to be a bastion of logic and order. But there was no logic here. The Izuku Midoriya he knew was the epitome of heroic spirit, selfless to a fault, endlessly compassionate. The chaos on the screen was his antithesis. The evidence was overwhelming, a mountain of data that his logical mind couldn't refute, yet his every instinct, every memory of his friend, screamed that it was impossible. Shoto Todoroki was silent, his heterochromatic eyes fixed on the screen, his expression unnervingly calm. He wasn't processing the emotional betrayal. He was dissecting the attack itself. The energy signature, he said, his voice a low monotone that cut through the silence. The news reports say it was a perfect match, and the quirks. Black Whip float. The technology to replicate that so perfectly, it would have to be incredibly advanced. State of the art. He was already looking for the seams, the inconsistencies, the strings that would reveal the puppeteer. He had lived his entire life under the shadow of manipulation. He was more prepared than anyone to recognize its shape, even when it was this grand, this horrifying. And then there was Katsuki Bakugo. He stood apart from the group, leaning against the wall, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He hadn't said a word since the broadcast began. His face was a thundercloud of pure, unadulterated rage, but it wasn't the explosive, petulant anger he was known for. This was something deeper, colder. It was the rage of someone witnessing an absolute, cosmic injustice. Kirishima put a hesitant hand on his shoulder. Bakugo. I can't believe it. Bakugo shrugged the hand off, not with aggression, but with a weary finality. He finally pushed himself off the wall, his crimson eyes scanning the heartbroken and confused faces of his classmates. You're all a bunch of idiots, he snarled, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. The insult lacked its usual fire. It was laced with something else. Frustration. Certainty. He jabbed a thumb at the television, where a replay of Deku's deepfake speech was being analyzed. You really think he did this? That shitty nerd who cries every time he saves a cat from a goddamn tree? The one who shattered every bone in his body just to live up to a promise? He let out a short, bitter, humorless laugh. Don't be stupid. That damn Deku isn't smart enough to plan something like this. He's not a mastermind. He's a goddamn sledgehammer with a hero complex. He turned and started walking towards the elevator, his back to them all. Whoever framed him, he said, his voice dropping so low it was almost a growl, is going to wish they'd never been born. It was the most fervent defense of Izuku Midoriya he had ever uttered. An insult wrapped around a core of absolute, unshakable belief. He knew Deku. Not the symbol, not the prodigy. He knew the stupid, crying, stubborn kid who would rather die than become what the world was now calling him. And that was a truth more real to him than any doctored video. In a darkened room elsewhere on campus, All Might, or what was left of him, the skeletal form of Toshinori Yagi, sat before a bank of monitors. He had rewound the footage of the escape a dozen times. He watched his successor, the boy he had entrusted with the world's most sacred power, use float to evade, black whip to defend, and Fa Gene to flee. He watched the boy he had raised as a hero use the very gifts he had given him to become a fugitive. Every flash of green lightning was a physical blow. Every strand of black whip was a whip lashing his own soul. The guilt was a suffocating shroud. Had he missed something? Were there signs? Was the pressure of one for all too much for the boy's mind? Did he, in his eagerness to find a successor, create a monster? A racking cough seized him, and he hunched over, his thin frame trembling. When he pulled his hand away from his mouth, it was stained with blood, the physical manifestation of his failing body, and the spiritual twin of his shattered heart. He looked at the screen, at the freeze frame of Izuku's face, twisted in a desperate snarl as he pulled down the water tower. My boy! Toshinori whispered to the empty room, his voice breaking. What have I done? The city lights of Yokohama were a distant, mocking smear of color. Izuku was miles away now, huddled in the deepest shadows of a derelict alley in the port district. The air was thick with the stench of brine, rust, and decay. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest. The shallow cuts from Hawks's feathers stung with a mixture of sweat and grime. His ankle throbbed from a bad landing. But the physical pain was a dull, distant echo compared to the howling abyss that had opened up in his soul. He was alone. Utterly, completely alone. He slid down a grimy brick wall, his legs giving out, and landed in a heap next to a collection of overflowing trash cans. The adrenaline had long since faded, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and a hollow, ringing despair. His hand went to his ear, his fingers fumbling for the comms unit. It was silent now, but for a while, it had been a source of torture. He'd heard their voices, Ida's frantic calls for him to surrender, Uraraka's tearful pleas, Endeavor's cold commands. He had listened until he couldn't take it anymore. This device. This small piece of plastic and wiring. It was his last connection to them. To his life. To Yue. To his friends. To All Might. As long as it was active, they could track him. And as long as it was active, there was a chance one of them might try to contact him, to help him, and in doing so, brand themselves a traitor's accomplice. He couldn't let that happen. He couldn't drag anyone else down with him. His fingers closed around the comm unit. It was a lifeline he had to sever. With a surge of bitter resolve, he pulled it from his ear and, without letting himself hesitate, slammed it against the brick wall. It shattered. The small pieces clattered to the filthy ground, the tiny green indicator light flickering one last time before dying forever. The silence that followed was absolute. He was officially a ghost. A cold drizzle began to fall, plastering his filth-caked hair to his forehead. He leaned his head back against the wall, the rough brick scraping his neck, and stared up at the sliver of light-polluted sky visible between the towering, decrepit buildings. A puddle had formed near his feet, its surface murky and disturbed by the falling raindrops. He caught his reflection in the water. It wasn't his face. It was a stranger's, gaunt, streaked with dirt and blood, with wild, haunted eyes that seemed to belong to a cornered animal. It was the face of a fugitive. The face of a villain. The face of chaos. He closed his eyes, the image seared into his mind. He was no longer Izuku Midoriya, the aspiring hero. He was no longer Deku, the symbol of hope. The world had given him a new name, and a new role to play. He was alone, he was hunted, and he was innocent. But in a world that had already judged and condemned him, innocence was a currency with no value. He was public enemy number one. And the long, dark night was just beginning. 3 weeks. 21 days. 504 hours. For Izuku Midoriya, time had devolved into a meaningless, agonizing crawl, measured not in the ticking of a clock but in the gnawing emptiness of his stomach, the rhythm of rain against corrugated iron, and the frantic, shallow breaths of a hunted animal. The life of a fugitive was a litany of miseries he had never imagined. It was the perpetual, bone-deep chill of damp clothes that never fully dried. It was the constant, low-grade headache of dehydration and malnutrition. It was the sharp, metallic taste of fear that coated his tongue every time he heard a distant siren or saw the glint of a uniform. He had learned the geography of the city's forgotten spaces, the skeletal frameworks of half-finished construction sites, the damp underbellies of bridges where the roar of traffic overhead was a constant, thunderous companion, and the labyrinthine alleyways choked with the refuse of a society that had cast him out. Tonight, his refuge was a narrow gap between a shuttered fish market and a brick tenement, a space that smelled potently of rust and rot. Rain fell in a steady, miserable drizzle, slicking the grime on the pavement, and turning the world a uniform, depressing gray. He was huddled under a flimsy sheet of scavenged plastic, shivering, his gaze fixed on a discarded newspaper just beyond his shelter. The headline, already blurring from the rain, was still legible under the faint glow of a street lamp. Chaos sighting in Kawasaki sparks panic. Nationwide manhunt intensifies. Below the headline was his face. A grainy photo taken from a security camera, his features obscured by a hood and shadow, but it was unmistakably him. The world saw a monster on the move. He just saw a boy trying to find a dry place to sleep. Hunger was a physical presence, a hollow, aching creature living in his gut. He hadn't eaten a real meal in days. Survival was a desperate calculus of risk versus reward. Dumpsters behind bakeries were gold mines, but often watched. Vending machines were fortresses of temptation, but using one was unthinkable. He had become a ghost, a wraith that flitted through the margins of society, his movements dictated by the primal needs his body screamed for. His greatest torment, however, was the prison of his own power. One for all, the sacred torch passed to him by his idol, was a roaring inferno locked inside him. It begged to be used. A single, minuscule burst of Fa gene could have launched him over a dozen city blocks to a safer hiding place. A wisp of smokescreen could have rendered him invisible. Float could have lifted him away from this filth and misery. But he couldn't. Not anymore. Using his quirks was like setting off a signal flare visible to every hero and satellite in the country. The unique energy signature that had once been his greatest asset was now his most damning liability, so he kept it caged. And the effort was monumental. It felt like holding back a tidal wave with his bare hands, the pressure building behind his ribs, a constant, agonizing strain. He was a god trying to pretend he was immortal, and the masquerade was shredding him from the inside out. He had become quirkless again, but this time, it was a choice, a penance and a strategy woven together. Last week, that strategy had been tested to its absolute limit. He had been scavenging in a sprawling industrial warehouse district, a place of silent, rusting giants. His danger sense, a quirk he couldn't turn off, had been a low, anxious hum for hours. He was used to that now. The entire world felt like a threat. But then it had spiked, a sharp, piercing needle of specific, directed intent. Someone was actively looking for him. Here. Now. He ducked behind a stack of shipping containers just as a figure landed silently on a nearby gantry. It was the pro-hero Rock Lock. Deku's heart had plummeted. He remembered him from the Shai Hasaikai raid, a pragmatic, no-nonsense hero with a family. A good man. I know you're in here, Chaos. Rock Lock's voice echoed through the cavernous space. The energy residue is faint, but it's yours. It's a dead end. Give up peacefully. Deku's mind had raced. He could have taken him. Even without a full power smash, a 5% burst would have been more than enough to incapacitate Rock-Lock and disappear. But the thought of raising a hand to him, to any hero, felt like a violation of his very soul. His flight from Endeavor had been a desperate, chaotic scramble. A calculated fight, even in self-defense, felt like a step further down the path they had already chosen for him. So he ran. He used the labyrinth of the warehouse as his shield, his smaller, unpowered frame allowing him to slip through gaps and shadows Rock-Lock couldn't. It became a terrifying game of cat and mouse. He could hear the hero's pursuit, the soft thud of his boots, the clink of his equipment. At one point, Rock-Lock had used his quirk, Lockdown, fixing a section of steel grating in place just as Deku was about to slip through it, trapping him. He'd been cornered. Rock-Lock approached slowly, his hands raised. "It's over, kid. Don't do this." Trapped, with his back to the locked grate, Deku had looked at the hero's face. He saw no malice, only a weary, sorrowful duty. In that moment, Deku had made a choice. He looked past Rock-Lock, at a heavy chain hoist hanging from the ceiling, its control panel just a few feet away. He threw a loose bolt he'd palmed earlier. It ricocheted off a steel beam and struck the down button. The massive chain and hook had descended with a deafening rattle, not on top of Rock-Lock, but directly between them, creating a sudden, noisy barrier. Rock-Lock, startled, had reflexively locked it in place. It was the opening Deku needed. He'd scrambled up the side of a container and disappeared into the rafters, his heart hammering a frantic, guilty rhythm. He hadn't fought. He hadn't harmed. He had used the environment, his wits, and a hero's own instincts against him. He had escaped, but the encounter had left a deep, psychological scar. He had outsmarted a man he once admired, treating him as an obstacle. It felt like another piece of his old self had crumbled away into dust. Far away, in the fortified sanctuary of Ue High, another soul was being tormented by the past. Tashinori Yagi sat in a small, windowless office he had commandeered, a room that had once been used for archival storage. It now served as his solitary war room, his tomb, his confessional. The air was stale, thick with the scent of old paper and lukewarm tea. The only light came from a single green-shaded desk lamp, casting a sickly pallor on the mountains of files, reports, and printouts that covered every surface. He hadn't slept in what felt like weeks. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw it, the deep-fake broadcast, the cold, dead eyes of the boy on the screen, the genuine betrayal on Endeavor's face, the desperate flight of his successor. The guilt was a physical weight, crushing his already frail body. He had chosen the boy. He had given him the power. He had placed the weight of the world on his shoulders. And somewhere, somehow, it had all gone so horribly, catastrophically wrong. He had believed the evidence. In the initial shock and horror, how could he not? The sheer perfection of the frame-up was its most convincing quality. But the initial tidal wave of grief had slowly receded, leaving behind the jagged bedrock of who he knew Izuku Midoriya to be. And the two images, the boy he knew and the monster on the screen, refused to reconcile. So he dug. He used his authority, as the former number one, to pull every file UA had on his successor. Psychiatric evaluations from Hound Dog, academic essays, Nisa's meticulous behavioral analyses, and most tellingly, the 13 worn, coffee-stained notebooks of hero analysis for the future that he had personally kept. 4 days, he cross-referenced, he read, he searched for the crack in the facade, the single loose thread that could unravel the whole tapestry of lies. His hands, thin and skeletal, trembled as he turned the pages, his own blood staining the corners of the reports from his racking coughs. He found it on the 21st day of Izuku's disappearance. He was rereading a transcript of the Chaos Manifesto for the 100th time. The words were burned into his brain. He came to the key ideological statement. True salvation does not come from 1,000 different heroes with 1,000 different agendas. It comes from a singular vision, a strong hand to guide, to protect, and to cleanse. Singular vision. A strong hand. It was the philosophy of a tyrant. It was the philosophy of all for one. Tashinori's eyes flickered to a different document on his desk. It was an essay Izuku had written for a class on hero ethics just before the war. The topic was the role of a symbol in a post-All Might era. He found the passage he was looking for, a section he remembered being particularly impressed with at the time. His finger traced the neat, slightly frantic handwriting. The era of a single pillar is, and should be, over. A single pillar can break. A single symbol can fall. The future of heroism isn't a monolith, it's a network. It's the strength found in 1,000 different heroes, with 1,000 different strengths, all working together. True salvation doesn't come from one person saving everyone, but from everyone working to save each other. Tashinori froze. He read the 2 passages again. A singular vision, the strength found in 1,000 different heroes, a strong hand to guide, everyone working to save each other. It wasn't just a difference of opinion. It was a fundamental, diametrically opposed ideology. This wasn't a hero who had fallen and twisted his own beliefs. This was someone else's beliefs being put into his mouth. The manifesto wasn't an evolution of Izuku's thinking, it was an invasion. The boy who had obsessively studied the collaborative efforts of every hero team in existence, who believed in the power of the collective more than anyone, could not have authored that cold, totalitarian speech. He couldn't. It was antithetical to the very fiber of his being. It was the first crack in the dam of his despair. A tiny, hairline fracture, but through it, a sliver of light shone. His hand, shaking for a different reason now, with a terrifying, burgeoning hope, fumbled for his phone. He scrolled through his contacts, his thumb hovering over a name he hadn't contacted in weeks, not wanting to face the man's questions, the man's truth-detecting quirk. Now, it was the only thing he wanted. He pressed the call button. It rang twice. Yagi? Detective Naomasa Tsukachi's voice was tired, strained. Tsukachi-kun. Tashinori's voice was a hoarse whisper. I need your help. Off the books. Off everything. There was a pause on the other end of the line. All Might, is this about the boy? Tashinori squeezed his eyes shut. I think we've made a terrible mistake. Izuku knew he couldn't hide forever. Survival wasn't enough. He had to fight back, and not with his fists. He needed information. He needed to know who was behind this, how they did it, and how to prove it. The public internet was a minefield, monitored and scrubbed. He needed to go deeper. He had spent 2 days gathering whispers, trading a scavenged battery for a scrap of information, following rumors through the city's underbelly. It led him here, to a place called The Glitch, an underground net cafe buried in the basement of a crumbling pachinko parlor in a part of town that didn't appear on most maps. He paid the entry fee with the last of the cash he'd had on him when his life ended, his face obscured by a deep hood and a cheap medical mask. The air inside was thick with the smells of stale cigarette smoke, sweat, and humming electronics. Rows of computer terminals were occupied by shadowy figures, information brokers, low-level hackers, and other fugitives from the light. It was a digital purgatory, and it was exactly what he needed. He found a terminal in the darkest corner, and began his search. He was clumsy at first, his fingers stiff from the cold. He bypassed the standard search engines, using back channels and encrypted forums he had only read about in theory. He searched for keywords: quirk replication technology, advanced deepfake, vocal synthesis, Project Chaos. Most of it was useless noise, conspiracy theories and panic chatter. But he found a thread, buried deep in a black market forum, that mentioned a new player on the scene, someone with a technology capable of creating flawless audio-visual forgeries for a price. The broker's handle was Doppelganger. There was no contact information, only a rumor that they operated through a specific data drop in this very district. A surge of adrenaline, the first positive kind he'd felt in weeks, shot through him. This was it. A lead. He was so focused, he didn't notice the hulking man at the front desk glance at him, then at a bounty notice pinned to a corkboard, then back at him. The man's eyes widened slightly. He picked up his phone and discreetly typed a message. Deku's danger sense flared, but not in the sharp way he was used to. It was a slow, creeping dread, the feeling of a net being tightened. He looked up from his screen. The atmosphere in the room had shifted. A few of the patrons were looking at him, their expressions a mixture of fear and avarice. The bounty on Chaos was astronomical, enough to set someone up for life. The front door of the parlor upstairs slammed open. Heavy footsteps echoed on the stairs. "They're here." He bolted from his chair, shoving past the terminal and making for a back exit marked with a faded, flickering sign. He burst through the door into another filthy alley, his heart pounding. He was met with a wall of heroes. Not the top-tier ones, but a team of competent, determined pros. There was a man whose arms were made of hardened coral, a woman who could extrude sticky, web-like substances from her palms, and their leader, a grim-faced man in tactical gear. "Nowhere to run, chaos!" the leader yelled. "Surrender!" Deku backed away, his hands raised. "I don't want to fight you. You've lost the right to say that," the woman shouted, and shot a thick glob of her sticky substance at his feet. He leaped back, the goo narrowly missing his boots. The coral-armed hero lunged, his fist extended, ready to pulverize him. Deku, running on pure instinct, dodged under the blow, the coral scraping his shoulder. He was outmatched. Without his quirks, he was just a tired, hungry teenager against a team of trained professionals. They were closing in, cutting off his escape. This was it. It was over, and then the world became bouncy. A sudden, theatrical twang echoed through the alley. A manhole cover at the hero's feet suddenly glowed with a soft pink light and became as elastic as a trampoline. The leader, caught mid-stride, was launched unceremoniously into the air, yelling in surprise. Good heavens, such unrefined aggression! A voice, rich with theatrical flair, boomed from a rooftop above. A performance utterly lacking in grace or subtlety. Deku looked up. Standing silhouetted against the night sky was a tall, silver-haired man in a long coat and top hat. Beside him, a much smaller figure with bright pink hair frantically typed on a high-tech laptop. Gentle criminal and la brava. What the? The web-slinging hero stammered, turning her attention to the newcomers. She fired a stream of her goo at the rooftop. Ah! Gentle chided, wagging a finger. He tapped the air in front of him. A shimmering pink film of elasticity appeared, catching the goo and flinging it right back at her, sticking her hands to the wall. La brava, my love! A little digital mischief, if you would be so kind, Gentle declared. On it, Gentle! La brava chirped, her fingers flying across the keyboard. A moment later, the hero's comms crackled with static, then began blasting an old, incredibly loud enka ballad. The coral-armed hero flinched, distracted, and Gentle took the opportunity. He leaped from the roof, his coat billowing behind him. He didn't fall, he bounced. He landed on an invisible elastic membrane he'd created in midair, then bounced again, ricocheting off the walls of the alley like a pinball. He moved with a bizarre, mesmerizing grace. He wasn't attacking the heroes. He was simply disorienting them, using his gently rebound quirk to turn the solid alleyway into an unpredictable bounce house. He tapped the leader's back as he fell, and the man bounced harmlessly off the ground and into a pile of soft trash bags. La Brava, meanwhile, had hacked the alley's lighting, plunging it into darkness, then hitting it with a strobing effect that was utterly disorienting. To Deku, it was the most surreal thing he had ever witnessed. Here were two wanted villains, taking down a team of pro-heroes without landing a single punch, all with the dramatic flair of a staged production. In the midst of the chaos, Gentle landed softly in front of Deku. He was older up close, with kind lines around his eyes that contrasted with his roguish grin. A moment, if you please, he said, then turned and created one last elastic film behind the stumbling heroes, sealing the alley entrance. They were trapped on the other side, confused and disoriented. He turned back to Deku, dusting off his coat. La Brava rappelled down from the roof on a cable, landing neatly beside him, her eyes wide and sparkling as she looked at Deku. Deku was speechless, his mind struggling to process the rescue. You! Why? La Brava spoke first, her voice full of breathless excitement. We saw the broadcast. And then we saw the news reports of your escape. It was all wrong. The theatrics, the monologue, it had all the subtlety of a sledgehammer. It lacked poetry. It wasn't your style at all. Gentle nodded sagely, stroking his magnificent mustache. Indeed, my dear. Izuku Midoriya. Your impromptu debut on the grand stage of villainy was explosive, to be sure, but its authenticity lacked a certain panache. A true artist of anarchy, a true gentleman villain, would never deliver such a brutish, on-the-nose manifesto. It was the work of an amateur. A boor, he leaned in, his eyes surprisingly sharp and intelligent. We, who have been unjustly painted with the broad brush of villainy by a society that fails to appreciate true performance, recognize a fellow soul being crushed under the weight of a false narrative. In short, my boy, we believe you've been framed. Deku stared at them, his mouth agape. For 3 weeks, the entire world had been screaming his guilt. Heroes, civilians, the media, everyone. And now, standing before him in a filthy alley, were 2 of the most eccentric criminals in Japan, and they were the only ones who believed him. The sheer, utter absurdity of it all was overwhelming. A choked, hysterical sound escaped his lips, half sob, half laugh. Gentle placed a gloved hand on his shoulder. It was a surprisingly comforting gesture. You are alone, hunted, and without resources. You are trying to unravel a masterpiece of deceit with nothing but your own conviction. He straightened up, striking a dramatic pose, one hand on his chest, the other gesturing magnanimously. We, your humble servants in societal rejection, would like to offer our assistance. He bowed deeply, his top hat sweeping low. The skills of La Brava in the digital realm and my own modest talents in the art of evasion are at your disposal. Together, we shall expose this shoddy production for the fraud it is and give you the chance to author your own, true story once more. The world, for Izuku Midoriya, had shrunk to the size of a single, unbelievable moment. 1 second, he was a cornered rat, his hope worn down to a nub, ready for the cage. The next, he was being offered salvation by a tea-loving gentleman villain and his hacker prodigy sidekick. The sheer whiplash of it left him reeling, his mind struggling to catch up to the absurdity of his new reality. He stared at gentle criminal, whose theatrical bow was held with the unwavering commitment of a master thespian. He looked at La Brava, whose large, expressive eyes were fixed on him with a look of fierce, determined empathy. They were villains. Wanted criminals. And yet, their belief in his innocence was a tangible thing, a warmth that pushed back against the frigid despair that had been his only companion for weeks. Why? Deku finally managed to ask, his voice hoarse from disuse. Why would you help me? Helping me makes you a target for everyone. La Brava puffed out her chest, a look of indignant loyalty on her face. Because it's the right thing to do. We know what it's like to have the world misunderstand you. They called Gentle a menace just for trying to bring a little excitement into their drab lives. They called me a stalker for dedicating my life to the one person who saw my talent. Her voice was filled with a passion that Deku hadn't heard directed at him in what felt like a lifetime. Your performance was faked. Your art was stolen. That's an insult to every true artist, hero or villain. Gentle straightened up, a gentle smile gracing his lips. He adjusted his cuffs with a practiced air of nonchalance. My dear La Brava puts it rather passionately, but her sentiment is the core of it, young Midoriya. I am a man of principle, however unorthodox those principles may seem. I believe in authenticity. The act committed in your name was a vulgar forgery, a crime not just against the law, but against the very concept of identity. To allow such a crude deception to stand is an affront I simply cannot abide. Besides, he added, his eyes twinkling, the challenge of unmasking a conspiracy of this magnitude, of outwitting the entirety of the hero system, it promises to be my greatest performance yet. Deku's exhausted mind processed their words. It wasn't a hero's logic. It wasn't a sense of civic duty, or a belief in justice. It was a bizarre, almost artistic code of ethics, a rebellion against a world they felt had wronged them. And right now, that was a logic he understood far better than the blind condemnation of his former allies. He had no other options. Trusting them was a leap into the abyss, but staying alone meant being consumed by it. He took a slow, deliberate breath, the first one that didn't feel like it was stolen. Okay, he said, the words small but firm. I accept. A brilliant, 1,000-watt smile broke out on La Brava's face. Gentle clapped his hands together once, a sharp, decisive sound. Excellent! Then we must not linger. The local constabulary will be recovering from their musical interlude shortly. This way, my boy. To our humble abode. With that, Gentle led the way, moving with a surprising stealth that belied his flamboyant nature. He led Deku through a warren of forgotten alleyways and service tunnels, a part of the city's circulatory system that was clogged and ignored. Deku, his body aching, forced himself to keep up, the small, flickering flame of hope in his chest urging him onward. Their destination was as improbable as they were. They emerged from a sewer grating into the cavernous, echoing space of an abandoned server farm. It was a cathedral of obsolete technology. Racks upon racks of silent, dust-shrouded servers stood like monoliths in the gloom, their indicator lights long since extinguished. It was a graveyard of the digital age, a place no one would ever think to look for human life. In the center of this technological mausoleum, they had carved out a surprisingly cozy and shockingly sophisticated hideout. A collection of mismatched but comfortable-looking furniture was arranged around a low table. A small, humming generator provided power to a string of warm, yellow lights and, most importantly, to a workstation that would have made UA's support department green with envy. It was La Brava's domain. A bank of monitors, at least 8 of them, were arrayed in a semicircle, displaying scrolling lines of code, network traffic data, and encrypted schematics. The combined processing power of a dozen daisy-chained, heavily modified server racks hummed quietly, cooled by a jury-rigged ventilation system that vented into an old industrial air shaft. "Welcome to the Gentle Archives," La Brava announced proudly, gesturing to her setup. "Fully insulated from the public net, powered by a self-sustaining source, and completely off the grid. We can see them, but they can't see us." Deku stared in awe. He had expected a squat, not a Bond villain's lair. "Please make yourself at home," Gentle said, already bustling around a small kitchenette set up in a corner. "You look as though you could use some sustenance. I shall prepare my signature blend of Ceylon tea, and I believe we have some biscuits that are not yet tragically stale." While Gentle prepared the tea with the meticulous care of a master craftsman, Deku, guided by La Brava, sat down in a worn but comfortable chair. The simple act of sitting somewhere soft, somewhere safe, was so foreign that his body almost didn't know how to react. He took off his hood, revealing the full extent of his haggard appearance. La Brava's cheerful expression faltered for a moment, replaced by a wave of sympathy. "You look terrible," she said, her tone blunt but not unkind. "There's a shower over there. Old janitor's closet. We got the water running. And some clean clothes. They're Gentles, so they might be a bit big." The offer of a hot shower felt more luxurious than a 5-star hotel. He nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. A short while later, he emerged from the makeshift bathroom, clean for the first time in weeks. The hot water had washed away the layers of grime and eased the deep ache in his muscles. He was dressed in a pair of gray trousers that were far too long and a soft, lavender-colored turtleneck that belonged to Gentle. It felt absurd, but it was warm and clean. A steaming cup of tea was waiting for him. He took it in both hands, letting the warmth seep into his chilled fingers. He took a sip. It was, without exaggeration, the best tea he had ever tasted. The simple, civilized act of drinking tea from a porcelain cup felt like an anchor, pulling him back from the brink of whatever feral creature he was becoming. For the first time in 21 days, Izuku Midoriya felt human again. He explained everything. He told them about the joint training exercise, the sudden explosion, the perfect replication of his quirks, and the chillingly accurate deepfake broadcast. He recounted his desperate flight from Endeavor and his subsequent weeks on the run. Gentle and La Brava listened intently, their expressions growing more serious. When he finished, Gentle stroked his mustache thoughtfully. "A performance of breathtaking cruelty," he mused. "To use a hero's own power, his own identity, as the weapon to destroy him. It lacks elegance, but its effectiveness is undeniable. The technology you describe, particularly the replication of your quirk's energy signature, is far beyond any known criminal enterprise." "That's what I thought," Deku said, his voice stronger now. "It has to be someone with incredible resources. Someone like All for One, the boogeyman himself," Gentle murmured. "A distinct possibility. His influence, like a fine wine, has a long and complex finish. Even from within Tartarus, his tendrils could be at play." La Brava, however, was already at her station, her fingers a blur across multiple keyboards. "All for One is the grand theory, but I need data. Let's start with the broadcast." Her eyes narrowed in concentration as she pulled up archived footage of the Chaos Manifesto. She isolated the audio and video streams, running them through a dozen different analysis programs of her own design. Lines of code scrolled across one screen, while waveforms and spectral analyses filled another. Okay, this is good, she muttered to herself. The video is a state-of-the-art deepfake, no question. The micro-expressions are flawless. The lighting is dynamically rendered. It's not just a face swap. The entire model is a perfect digital puppet. Whoever made this is a genius. A sick, evil genius, but a genius. She then turned her attention to the audio. The voice is even better. It's not just mimicry, it's a full vocal synthesis built from thousands of hours of source material, news interviews, festival announcements, probably even comms chatter they hacked. They didn't just copy your voice, they rebuilt it from the ground up. She leaned back, a grim look on her face. The problem is, it's too good. The forgery is layered so perfectly with compression artifacts and broadcast noise that proving it's fake to a forensics lab would be next to impossible. They'd call it inconclusive. We need the source file, the rendering program, or the digital artist who made it. And people like that don't leave a trail. Deku's burgeoning hope faltered. So it's a dead end? I didn't say that, La Brava said, a spark of defiance in her eyes. Nothing is ever a dead end. No digital creation is perfect. There's always a watermark, a ghost in the machine. I just need to find it. She set her programs to run a deep-level algorithmic search, a process that would take hours, looking for fractional inconsistencies in the video's metadata, stray code strings, anything that didn't belong. While my dear La Brava communes with the digital spirits, Gentle announced, we shall focus on the physical. These devices that replicated your quirks. They must have been manufactured somewhere. If we can trace them, we may find our puppet master. This was something Deku could contribute to. The energy, it felt real. It even fooled my own danger sense. The lightning, the black whip, it was like looking in a distorted mirror. The technology had to be based on my quirk. Maybe they got data from my old hospital visits? Or from Yue? It was a terrifying thought, that his own history, his own body, had been weaponized against him. The investigation had begun. For the next 2 days, the server farm was a hive of quiet, focused activity. Deku, fueled by La Brava's surprisingly good cooking and Gentle's endless supply of tea, finally had the mental space to think, to analyze, to be the hero he was, even in the shadows. He provided Gentle and La Brava with every scrap of information he could remember about his quirks, their feel, their energy output, their specific visual tells. La Brava's deep dive into the broadcast seemed to be yielding nothing, the digital fortress of the deepfake proving impenetrable. But Deku noticed something else. Try cross-referencing the timing of the broadcast with hero communication logs, Deku suggested, pacing behind her. The timing was too perfect. Endeavor's order for students to fall back, my location. They knew everything. La Brava's fingers flew. Good thinking, Green Bean. Accessing archived HPSC comms traffic from that day. It's heavily encrypted, but nothing stays locked when La Brava comes knocking. A few minutes later, she swore under her breath. They had a backdoor into the Pro-Hero comms network. A high-level one. They were listening to everything in real time. That's how they coordinated the attack to pin it on you so perfectly. You were never meant to be at the epicenter. You were meant to be close enough to be a suspect, but far enough away that you couldn't immediately disprove it. The cold, calculated nature of the plan was chilling. They hadn't just framed him. They had used the entire hero system as a prop in their stage play. While Deku was finding his footing in the underworld, Katsuki Bakugo was waging his own war against uncertainty. He was a creature of explosive action, and the enforced inaction at Yuri was driving him insane. The school was on lockdown, a gilded cage filled with sorrow and suspicion. He couldn't stand the pitying looks, the whispers, the way everyone walked on eggshells around the topic of Deku. He refused to believe it. It was a simple, immutable fact in his mind. Deku was an idiot, a crybaby, a damn nerd who followed All Might around like a lost puppy. He was not a cold, calculating terrorist. Bakugo, who had known Izuka Midoriya since they were toddlers, knew his rival's soul better than anyone. And this was not it. He needed to do something. And he knew just the person he needed. Someone who operated outside the box. Someone whose quirk was designed to get to the truth. He broke curfew, slipping out of the Heights Alliance building with a practiced ease that would have horrified Aizawa. He made his way to the General Studies dorm, a building he had never once had a reason to visit. He found the room he was looking for and pounded on the door, foregoing any pretense of subtlety. The door opened a crack. Hitoshi Shinso, looking perpetually exhausted, peered out, his wild purple hair even more unruly than usual. Bakugo? What the hell are you doing here? It's after midnight. Bakugo pushed the door open and stepped inside, letting it close behind him. Shinso's room was sparse, neat, and quiet. I need your help, Bakugo said, his voice a low growl. He didn't do pleading. He did demanding. Shinso raised an eyebrow, leaning against his desk. My help with what? Getting extra credit in anger management? Bakugo ignored the jibe. He met Shinso's tired gaze, his own crimson eyes burning with a fierce intensity. It's about Deku. Shinso's expression shifted, his casual posture stiffening. The topic was a raw nerve for the entire school. What about him? He was framed, Bakugo stated, not as a theory, but as a fact. And we're going to prove it. Shinso stared at him, surprised by the raw conviction. He had his own doubts. Midoriya, the boy who had broken his fingers to prove a point to him, who had encouraged him and seen him as a future hero when no one else did, it didn't track. But the evidence. And how are we supposed to do that? Shinso asked, his voice cautious. The HPSC has the case locked down tighter than Tartarus. That's where you come in, Bags, Bakugo said, a predatory grin spreading across his face. You can make people talk. Make them tell the truth. There are 100 people involved in this investigation, from cops to HPSC paper pushers. Someone, somewhere, saw something that didn't fit. Someone got an order that felt wrong. We just need to find them and ask. Shinso's eyes widened slightly as he grasped the sheer audacity of Bakugo's plan. It was illegal. It was reckless. It was vigilantism. It was also the only plan that had a snowball's chance in hell of working. He saw the desperate fire in Bakugo's eyes, a fire that had nothing to do with rivalry and everything to do with a fierce, buried loyalty. He thought of Midoriya, who had been one of the first people to treat his quirk not as a villain's tool, but as a hero's. Maybe it was time he started using it like one. A slow, tired smile touched Shinso's lips. This is a terrible idea, he said. We'll be expelled. Or arrested. So what? Bakugo shot back. Let them try. Shinso was silent for a long moment, the weight of the decision hanging in the air. Then he nodded. Fine. But we do this my way. Quietly. No explosions, Bakugo scoffed. Whatever. Just tell me when and where. A secret, two-man investigation team was born in the dead of night, fueled by Bakugo's rage and Shinso's unique, truth-extracting talent. Back in the Gentle Archives, La Brava suddenly let out a triumphant gasp. Got it! She yelled, startling both Deku and Gentle. She pointed a shaking finger at one of her monitors. A ghost! I found a ghost! Deku rushed to her side. What is it? In the deepfake broadcast, she explained, her voice breathless with excitement. It's buried under 17 layers of compression and encryption, but it's there. A ghost signal. A tiny, encrypted data packet, less than a kilobyte, piggybacking on the main signal. It was broadcast at the exact same time. What is it? A message? Gentle asked, peering at the screen. I don't know yet. It's a fragment, and the encryption is insane. It looks like military-grade stuff, but twisted. It's going to take me a while to— Oh no, her face went pale. On her main screen, a red warning box flashed to life, overlaying her programs. Alarms, silent and digital, screamed across her network. Intrusion detected. Counter-intrusion protocols engaged. Someone's in my system, she whispered, her voice tight with panic. They traced my trace. They're good. They're really, really good. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, a desperate dance of defense. Firewalls materialized only to be torn down moments later by a relentless, unseen attacker. Lines of code battled lines of code, a silent, lightning-fast war being fought in the heart of her machine. "I can't stop them!" she cried out, her voice cracking. "They're not just trying to block me, they're trying to locate us. They're purging the data." Deku watched helplessly as the code on her screen dissolved into digital gibberish, the precious data packet she had found corrupting before their eyes. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the attack stopped. La Brava's defensive programs reported the intruder had withdrawn. But the damage was done. The ghost signal was gone, wiped clean, and then, a new window opened on her main monitor. No complex code. No flashy graphics. Just plain, white text on a black background. A simple, chilling message sitting there for them all to see. "Stop digging." The three of them stared at the screen, the two words a silent, digital scream. It was a warning. A threat. They had poked the beast, and now the beast was looking back. They were no longer just investigating a crime. They were now officially at war with the monster who framed him. The Underground Alliance had its first taste of real contact, and it was terrifying. The two words on the screen, "Stop digging," pulsed with a silent, malevolent energy that seemed to suck the warmth from the room. The air in the server farm, once a sanctuary, now felt thin and charged, like the moment before a lightning strike. La Brava sat frozen, her hands hovering over her keyboard, her face pale. The casual confidence she usually wore like a second skin had been stripped away, replaced by the wide-eyed shock of a hacker who had just touched a digital ghost. "They're gone," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They wiped the packet, scrubbed their entry logs. It's like they were never here. Except for..." She gestured a trembling finger at the message. Gentle Criminal placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. His usual flamboyant demeanor had vanished, replaced by a grim, focused intensity. "They made a mistake, my love," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "A threat is an acknowledgement. It is proof that we are on the right path. They are afraid." "They're not afraid," Deku countered, his own voice tight. He was pacing behind them, a caged tiger, the phantom energy of one for all crackling under his skin. He felt a desperate urge to do something, to punch something, but his enemies were formless, digital. "They're confident." That was a display of power. "They wanted us to know they can reach us anytime, anywhere. They're telling us to back off before they sweat us like flies." The raw aggression in his tone surprised even himself. The weeks of fear and desperation were beginning to calcify into something harder, something angrier. He looked at La Brava's shaken expression, and a wave of guilt washed over him. He had dragged them into this. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice softening. "You shouldn't have to be a part of this. It's too dangerous." La Brava spun around in her chair, a spark of her usual fire returning to her eyes. "Don't you dare, Izuka Midoriya! Don't you dare try to sideline me now! They hacked my system. They insulted my craft. This isn't just your fight anymore. This is personal." Gentle smiled, a flicker of pride in his eyes. "Indeed. An artist must defend their gallery. While the digital trail may have grown cold for the moment, it has proven one thing beyond a shadow of a doubt. We are not chasing a ghost. We are chasing a dragon, and it has just shown us its teeth." The moment of defiance was a small victory against the chilling threat, but the reality remained. Their best lead had been turned to ash. They were back to square one, with the added disadvantage of knowing a powerful, unseen enemy was now actively watching them. A heavy, frustrated silence settled over the small group as they contemplated their next move. Miles away, within the sanitized, oppressive quiet of UA's lockdown, a very different kind of alliance was taking shape. It was born not in a dramatic declaration, but in a series of quiet, stolen conversations in hallways, of shared, meaningful glances over untouched meals in the cafeteria, and of encrypted text messages exchanged in the dead of night. It started with Achiko Uraraka. She couldn't eat. She couldn't sleep. The official narrative felt like a physical weight pressing down on her, suffocating her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Deku's face, not the cold, cruel mask from the broadcast, but his real face, dusted with freckles, his eyes wide with earnest determination, his smile that could make her feel like she could float without even using her quirk. The two images were irreconcilable. Her heart, her gut, her every instinct screamed that the boy she knew, the boy she cared for so deeply, was incapable of such monstrousness. One evening, unable to bear the silence of her room, she found herself in the dormitory's kitchen, staring blankly at a kettle, her mind a million miles away. "You're thinking about him," the voice, low and steady, startled her. She turned to see Shoto Todoroki standing in the doorway, his expression, as usual, difficult to read. But his heterochromatic eyes held a rare, direct sort of empathy. Uraraka's composure, stretched thin for weeks, finally snapped. Her eyes welled up with tears she could no longer hold back. "I don't believe it, Todoroki-kun," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I can't. It doesn't make sense. The Deku-kun we know, he would fight until his body broke to save one person. He wouldn't do that." Todoroki nodded slowly, stepping into the kitchen. "I agree. His core principles are pathologically heroic. The actions attributed to him represent a complete ideological inversion. It's not a logical progression. It's a fabrication." Hearing her own desperate belief articulated so calmly, so logically, was like a lifeline. "You think so too?" "I do," he said, his gaze unwavering. "My father, he is many things. But he is a thorough investigator. After the incident, I used his login to access the preliminary HPSC report on the technology used in the attack." Uraraka's eyes widened. "You what? The devices that replicated Midoriya's quirks?" Todoroki continued, ignoring her surprise. "They were based on a new form of energy resonance technology. Officially, the report states they were developed by a rogue scientist and stolen. But I dug into the component manifests. The primary energy converter, the most crucial part, a dozen units were manufactured by a subsidiary of the Endeavor Agency 6 months ago. They were for a project researching how to neutralize quirk energy signatures at a distance." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "According to my father's internal server, those 12 units were reported stolen 3 weeks before the Yokohama attack. The theft was never made public. It was buried." Uraraka stared at him, her mind racing. "So the tech that was used to frame Deku-kun came from your father's agency?" "It seems so," Todoroki said, his expression grim. "It doesn't mean he was involved. It's more likely his agency was infiltrated. But it's a thread. It's a piece that doesn't fit the official story. It proves there's more going on than the HPSC is admitting." The conversation was a spark. The next day, Uraraka found Tenya Ida in the library, poring over legal texts concerning villain prosecution and evidence admissibility. His face was drawn and pale. He was trying to reconcile his faith in the system with his loyalty to his friend, and the conflict was tearing him apart. Uraraka approached him quietly. "Ida-kun, can we talk?" She relayed what Todoroki had told her. As she spoke, she saw the rigid posture of the class representative begin to soften, the conflict in his eyes replaced by a dawning, horrified realization. "A cover-up?" Ida whispered, pushing his glasses up his nose with a trembling hand. "To conceal a security breach of that magnitude from the number one hero's agency. It's a gross dereliction of duty. It calls the entire integrity of the initial investigation into question." "Exactly," Uraraka said, pressing her advantage. "The official story is full of holes. We can't just sit here and let them bury Deku-kun based on lies." The seed of doubt had been planted. Now, it was beginning to sprout. The three of them, Uraraka, the heart, Todoroki, the mind, and Ida, the conscience, formed the core of what they started calling, in hushed whispers, the Deku Defense Squad. Their first secret meeting took place in one of UA's many disused storerooms, a cramped space that smelled of dust and floor polish. It was there that Todoroki revealed another piece of his clandestine research. "I've been monitoring my father's communications," he said, his voice low. "He's been working with all might. Secretly. They're running their own investigation. They don't believe the official story either." The relief that washed over Uraraka and Ida was immense. All might. If he was on their side, there was hope. "But they're moving slowly, carefully," Todoroki warned. "They're trying to unravel this from the top down. We need to work from the bottom up. We need to do something they can't. We need to contact him," Uraraka said, the words tumbling out. We need to let Deku-kun know that he's not alone. That we believe him. Ida looked stricken. But how? He destroyed his comms unit. Any conventional digital communication would be monitored by the HPSC. Attempting to contact a designated SSS-rank villain is tantamount to treason. Then we have to be unconventional. A gruff voice said from the doorway. They all jumped. Leaning against the doorframe, his arms crossed and a thunderous scowl on his face, was Katsuki Bakugo. Standing just behind him, looking deeply uncomfortable, was Hitoshi Shinso. How long have you been there? Ida demanded, his hand chopping the air in his characteristic, albeit frantic, fashion. Long enough to hear you morons state the obvious. Bakugo sneered, stepping into the room. Of course we need to contact him. And I know how. All eyes turned to him. Bakugo's gaze wasn't directed at any of them, but at the floor, a flicker of something unreadable, perhaps a memory, perhaps embarrassment, in his eyes. Before Yue, he began, his voice uncharacteristically subdued. Back when we were kids. Deku, he was an obsessive little creep. He spent all his time on the internet, on hero forums. There was one, an old crappy one. The Silver Age Sanctuary. It was for All Might superfans. The old school ones? He was on it constantly. He looked up, his crimson eyes intense. The site is practically a fossil now. No one's posted on it in years. The HPSC would never think to monitor a dead forum for dusty old nerds. But he would, if he's desperate, if he's looking for any kind of sign. It's the one place he might think to check. A place from his past. A place that belongs to him, not to the hero Deku. A stunned silence filled the room. It was a brilliant, deeply personal piece of insight. It came from a place of shared history, a knowledge of Izuku Midoriya that none of the rest of them possessed. That is an exceptionally clever plan, Ida admitted, his animosity towards Bakugo momentarily forgotten in his admiration for the strategy. So how do we post a message only he would understand? Uraraka asked. We don't use words, Todoroki said, his mind already working on the problem. We use something he would recognize as ours. A code. The plan came together quickly. Ida, a stickler for rules and procedure, remembered the specific alphanumeric code assigned to their class for the Provisional Hero License Exam, 1APLEX2. It was a meaningless string of characters to anyone else, but to someone from their class, it was a unique identifier. They would embed it in a seemingly random post. Shiso, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke up. The account has to be untraceable. I can acquire a secure login from a guy I know, create a few digital false trails to throw off anyone who might stumble on it. His expertise in the shadows was proving invaluable. That night, the plan was put into action. Shinso secured a burner account. Ida drafted the post, a simple, innocuous message under the topic. Favorite All Might era support items. Remember the Airjet Sols? Always thought their model number was strange. Something like 1APLEX2. Probably just a random designation, but it always stuck with me. It was a pebble tossed into a vast, silent ocean. All they could do now was wait, and pray that their friend was desperate enough, and sentimental enough, to see it. Deku was at his lowest point. The cyber attack had been a devastating blow. Their only lead was gone, and the knowledge that they were being watched had draped a pall of paranoia over their hideout. La Brava was working feverishly to reinforce her security, her usual bubbly demeanor replaced by a grim, focused silence. Gentle was trying to maintain morale with exquisite tea and optimistic monologues, but even he couldn't hide the deep worry in his eyes. Deku felt useless. He was a warrior without a weapon, a hero without a stage. He spent his time trying to help where he could, organizing supplies, cleaning, standing guard, but it was busy work. His mind, used to processing thousands of variables in a high-stakes battle, was adrift. He found himself retreating into the past. It was a form of self-soothing, a way to remember who he was before the world had branded him a monster. He thought about his mother, a pang of guilt so sharp it made him gasp. He thought about All Might, the memory now a complex mixture of adoration and a deep, sorrowful ache. And he thought about his friends. He remembered the sports festival, the training camps, the late nights studying in the common room. He remembered Ida's rigid but well-meaning lectures, Uraraka's bright, infectious laugh, Todoroki's quiet intensity, and even Kaken's explosive, begrudging respect. These memories were his most precious possession, the only things his enemies couldn't touch. It was during one of these nostalgic dives that a thought surfaced, a relic from a forgotten era. The Silver Age Sanctuary, the forum where he'd spent countless hours as a lonely, quirkless kid, dissecting All Might's battles, debating his top 10 finishing moves, and connecting with other fans who shared his passion. He hadn't thought about that place in years. On a whim, driven by a desperate need to connect with any part of his old life, he approached La Brava. "Can you get me onto a website?" he asked, his voice hesitant. "It's old. Probably not monitored. I just want to see it." La Brava, glad for the distraction, nodded. "Give me the address." She navigated through a series of proxies and firewalls, her digital footprint a ghost. A few moments later, a familiar, clunky, and wonderfully nostalgic web page loaded on one of her screens. The design was straight out of the early internet age, full of clashing colors and pixelated GIFs of All Might. It was the Silver Age Sanctuary. It was like coming home. His heart ached as he scrolled through the old threads, his own username, AllMightFan01, appearing again and again. It was a digital ghost of the boy he used to be. Most of the forums were dead, the last post years old. But one was new. It was in the Support Items subforum. The title was innocuous, but the content made his breath catch in his throat. Model number was strange. Something like 1APLEX2, 1APLX2. It wasn't a model number. It was them. It was his class. It was a message. A flare sent up in the darkness, just for him. They knew. They believed him. The relief was so sudden, so overwhelming, that his legs gave out. He stumbled back, catching himself on a server rack. Tears, hot and immediate, welled in his eyes. He wasn't crying from sorrow or despair, but from a profound, earth-shattering gratitude. He wasn't alone. His friends, his loyal few, were fighting for him. The message was a lifeline. It was a shield. It was a weapon. It reignited the fire in his soul that had been dwindling to embers. He wiped the tears from his eyes, a new, unshakable resolve hardening his features. He turned to Gentle and La Brava, his expression transformed. "They're out there," he said, his voice filled with a power they hadn't heard before. "My friends. They believe me. And they're trying to help." But this moment of profound hope was shattered by a sudden, piercing shriek. It wasn't a human sound. It was the screech of tearing metal, followed by a deafening crash from the other side of the server farm. Deku's danger sense, which had been a dull thrum of generalized anxiety, exploded into a single, blinding point of absolute, predatory malice. It was a feeling he had only felt a few times before. It was the feeling of Enoma. The three of them scrambled behind a rack of servers, peering through the gaps. A section of the far wall, the thick concrete that led to an old subway tunnel, had been torn open as if it were wet paper. Standing in the breach was a creature from a nightmare. It was Enomu, but unlike any he had seen before. It was sleek, almost serpentine, not bulky like the ones from the USJ or Hosu. Its skin was a pale, sickly gray, and its exposed brain pulsed with a faint, green light. But the most terrifying feature was its head. It had no face, no eyes, no mouth. In its place was a complex array of what looked like organic antennae, twitching and rotating, scanning the room. It can't be," La Brava stammered, her face ashen. "There's no way anything could have found us here."